Well, that concludes all our contributions from the practitioners today. But now we come to the questions session. We already have a good number of questions that have been submitted, but I'd like you, please, if you are happy to send in your questions using the function on the screen, and I'll do my best over the next few minutes to answer as many as I can. Okay, now is the time. We'll move on to the questions and answers. I've already had 50 questions submitted, so I'll go through those. But first of all, I want to just put a poll up on the screen for you, because we just want to get a feel of how many of you are well into the Chinese market already. So if you could respond to that, that would be helpful. I must now remind you all that this webinar is part of the European Commission's partnership in the European Tourism Programme. This, as I think most of you will know, is to be delivered by ETOA, ETC, and ECTA with the support of Welcome Chinese. Now, during 2018, so just a few weeks' time, the EU China Tourism Year commences, and during this year you'll have many opportunities to partake in a range of opportunities to learn more about the Chinese market and how it's been developed with the help of the European Commission partnership during 2018 and of course future. There's a log on for you which I'll give right at the end, but I'll give it to you now. Euro or EU Travel Partnership.org. We'll put that up on the screen so you can see that, but that's the way to log on to make sure that you keep up to date with all the program for the EU China Tourism Year. Right, now I have some questions, so I'll go straight on to these. What I've done is to link the questions together. 50 of them, there's no time to go through them all, but there's some common themes that are coming through of these. So I have them before me, and I'll just try and lump them together for you. A lot of people are anxious about the language barrier. Obviously, language is so important in travel and tourism. But now, for the Chinese, we are noticing in the last 5 or 6 years that many of the Chinese that are coming to Europe do have English and also French and German, the main European languages, because they have studied over in Europe and they are able to use this language when they come out to travel, maybe as a tourism. So although it's still very, very important and particularly essential for group travel, so those of you that are in the ADS market, then you must offer either an audio or a guide, because most of the travellers in the ADS market will be needing some help with your local language. So that's really quite important. However, the other thing that we must remember is that over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a huge number of Chinese that have come over to Europe to study. And therefore they're learning the European languages, they've taken a range of degrees. So it's important that, again, that you respect their language and don't obviously talk down to them, but understand that they will want to use their language, German, French, Spanish, English, when they come traveling. So be ready for that. These will be in the younger generation, maybe 25, 28 through to 40-ish as a guide. In my experience of 20 years in the market, the senior people, that's maybe 50 and over, they will have language skills, but they'll be reluctant to use them because of this issue that I'm sure many of you heard about, the point about face. They won't want to be seen to be struggling with your European language. So be aware of that, and that really is quite important. Let me just look at other things. Oh yes, there's been a range of questions about budget. The Chinese are keen to get value for money. There's no doubt about that. And quite a few of the questions, mostly from the more experienced tour operators and attractions in France and Germany, were clearly having difficulty with the Chinese wanting to bid down the price of their tour or entrance into a attraction or even a hotel bill. Now, in my experience, you've just got to be firm on your pricing. If you want to come down, or if you've got scope to come down, then do come down in price, but be firm. I always tell my staff that one of the very best words that Chinese will understand in any language is no. And if you need to, then just hold your line and say, no, I'm sorry, that is the price. Otherwise, the Chinese will bid you down if you allow them to. But they're quite happy if you say, no, that's the price, well, then they'll say, fine. They're not going to argue further. The other point that we need to think about is the scale of their travel. Again, over 20 years, most of the travel in the early 15, 20 years ago was through the ADS, through the groups. Still have groups, big groups across Europe and here in the UK. But they are becoming less, lower as a percentage of the whole. That means, of course, that the increase is quite often in FIT, in MICE market. MICE is becoming a market which I'll cover later, but it's something that we need to be aware of, and it's very, very interesting how in the last 2 or 3 years that has developed. So I'll come back to the MICE market later. There's a lot of you that have been asking about small deluxe type hotels. There is a market for this, for certain, but many of the groups that are coming over are large groups. So you need to specialize and look at what we're terming now family groups. Now, family groups tend to obviously be of a relative or a whole group of family. But you'll see that there's the man and wife, quite often, their parents, and the one child. So you've got a group of 7. Again, quite often, either of the parents, the husband or the wife, will have traveled to Europe as a business traveller, maybe, or been part of a larger delegation. And now they want to come as a tourist. This is a really interesting and growing market, and one that you can attract and be of interest via social media. Again, there's some questions later that I want to mention about social media, because that again in the last 2 or 3 years has really taken off, and we must all be very aware of how the Chinese are interacting with us in Europe via the social media. Okay, I think I'm just looking at that poll, which is excellent. We have some good responses to that, and thank you for that. I think maybe we can do the next poll now and just gather that in. So the first one's finished, and there's another one just coming up now for you to have a look at, and it would be very, very helpful for us if you could respond to that one. We've still got plenty of time to go through, and if you have any questions that you want to type in whilst I'm talking, I'm looking at the screen at the same time. Hopefully I can pick some of them up and answer them as we're going through. Okay, now I want to go on to some general questions about what type of tour we should offer the Chinese when they're coming over. There's a group of people from Portugal, and I'm grouping some of the questions together. And I think maybe the Portuguese market is relatively new, and there's some, I think, just not sure of what to offer. Well, it's a general across the whole of Europe. whatever is your speciality, don't try to be something that you're not. Don't try to be a country of history going back centuries upon centuries, if yours is much more a modern history, or if yours is of interest to maybe nature lovers rather than city dwellers. So whatever you've got, whatever your areas of strength are, then just play to those. So Portugal in particular, I just want to spend a little bit of time on Portugal. That here there's obviously beaches down the south. The Chinese in the last 10 years have taken, to my surprise really, quite a lot of interest in beach holidays. I used to say 10 years or so ago, don't worry about beach holidays for the Chinese because they don't relax. Well, it's totally changed. And now you look on their highest, where they visit, the Chinese visiting, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, are very, very high. And most of these tourists are going for the beach holiday. So Portugal for certain, that's an area that I think you can easily concentrate on. You need to make it fairly all-inclusive and just attractive to for a bleak 5-star market. Most of the European travellers that are travelling for the sun won't be looking for a 2- or 3-star accommodation. They will be looking for premier and all-inclusive type resorts. The other thing again, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've noticed more and more Chinese are interested in hiring cars. Again, this is something 15 years ago we would have never heard of, but it's becoming more common for FIT groups, particularly these family groups that I was mentioning, for the parents to be hiring a car. Of course, they're driving in China, and if you've ever been to China, I've always said that the Chinese must be brilliant drivers because how they don't have so many accidents in I cannot imagine. Their driving technique is strange, and certainly very strange for us in Europe. So car hire is an area and is something that I think you need to think about, and I think would work particularly if you're working into the FIT medium to top end. And I've also had some queries, questions in from Latvia and Lithuania. Now, and they are talking about business travel and how to attract, I think maybe they're looking at inward investment here because the Chinese are very active, as we all know, in investing inwards into Europe. It is a key issue, and we have found in France, Germany, UK, many of the investors that are now investing and seriously investing came across as part of a business delegation maybe 10, 12 years ago. It will take time. None of the tourism attractions, none of the tourism visitors come overnight. You need to have a plan. You need to, as we all say, plan for the long term. So I think that in new countries like the Baltic states, I think an area for you particularly to look for is to try and attract inward investors, try to attract business travellers, and then as they come across, then they will be more interested in returning to your country as tourists in the future. Another question has come in from the Netherlands. They were particularly interested in trying to attract the student population that's here in Europe. Now again, I'm sure most European countries there are Chinese students that are undertaking often master's degrees at all your universities. These are, generally speaking, from relatively wealthy families and are over in your country for maybe 18 months, 2 years, doing a master's degree. In our experience here in the UK, they are very keen on exploring Europe whilst they are studying. Everywhere, of course, we know that students have fairly lengthy holidays, vacations, and if you can attract these students, so we're talking about the Netherlands and in Holland, if you are able to link in with, say, a French university, German university, London English universities, and see whether you can attract those visitors. They're already here. They're not flying 5,500 miles to come. They're in Europe. The huge advantage that you have with students, the master's graduates, they'll be in their early to mid-20s. Generally speaking, they come from wealthy families, as I say, and their parents will be very keen to visit them whilst they are in Europe. So if you can attract those students, there's a fair chance you'll also attract the VFRs with them. So I'll just talk a little bit to one side there on the VFRs and the mixture, if you like, from the master's graduates. So this is a family group, but you've got the daughter or the son effectively showing the parents around your country, if it's a French university, or taking them to Germany or neighbouring countries. So again, you've got to be careful how to not talk down to the parents. You must acknowledge that this family group, which will possibly be 3 people, mother and father and the child, they will, generally speaking, be fairly wealthy. The parents may not speak your language, but without a doubt, their child, their daughter or son will. So be aware of that. Have maybe an audio for the parents, which you could offer if they wanted it. They could take it. Again, save them the face. Don't expect them to speak German or French or Spanish when they come over. That's becoming a key issue. I'm just looking down on the questions that are coming in. You're firing questions now, thick and fast. There's a question here that's just come in from Barcelona. I mean, we in Europe are having big concerns over security. In China, they are anxious, they are aware of the security issues that we have. China is, touch wood, he says, saying this, at the moment, a very safe and secure country. But they are aware, the Chinese are aware. I think they are quite accepting that it isn't possible to safeguard everybody all the time. So just sensible safeguards and try and reassure everybody that follow the guide, follow the instructions, don't go to places where really, I mean, there's places in China that I wouldn't go. I've been to China for many, many years. Still I wouldn't go to, and the same in all the countries. So I wouldn't worry too much about the terrorism issue, although we are seeing, and we have seen in France, Belgium, London, a drop-off of Chinese immediately after, maybe for 6 weeks or so, but quite quickly figures are being restored. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. There is something, just talking about Barcelona, that we spoke of the recent conference for ETOA. We were talking about over-tourism. That again is something that is a concern to many countries, and Barcelona is of course one of the areas that are concerned about over-tourism. And China are also very, very aware of this. In fact, President Xi, in his recent 3.5-hour address to the nation, if you like, at their recent Congress, part of that was about the Chinese being good ambassadors when they go overseas. So there's clear instructions from the Chinese government for the Chinese, when they are tourists, and of course on business, to behave properly. So they should be biddable. The Chinese, you should find, if you ask them not to smoke, you ask them not to do this or to queue over there, you should find nowadays that they are biddable. 20 years ago, it was certainly different. I keep on saying 20 years ago, but honestly, the market is changing. It's changing now, and I think we'll see maybe in the next 5 years huge changes in the type of tourism that we are seeing from China into Europe. Right, let's just see. Oh yes, one or two. Where was this from? I think this was from Turkey. The question, we're talking about wine and whether the Chinese are acquiring the taste for wine. There is no doubt that the Chinese are acquiring the taste of wine. Many of you have heard the stories about 15 years ago that the Chinese, and to be honest, I think it was also true of the Russians, were very adept at mixing red wine with Coca-Cola because it made it taste a little better. Well, honestly, that type of anecdote is no longer true of the Chinese, and I'm sure of the Russians as well. They do very much enjoy good wine. And whilst I was looking at these questions, I did some research over the weekend, and somebody is telling us, I'm not too sure whether this is true, but in 5 years' time, this article was saying that will be more Chinese-owned vineyards across the world than any other countries, nations owning vineyards. So I think what we're seeing here is that the Chinese realize that yes, they can make wine, but it is so much better to buy a quality chateau in France, good producer in California, or of course any of the producers in Australia. So I think what we're seeing is that the Chinese, as they've done with many other industries, are acquiring these vineyards, and therefore, of course, they will be able to import this quality wine into China, and when they come across to Europe and across the world, they will be much, much more knowledgeable about wine. So wine is an area that I think you can start thinking about having tours, vineyard tours across Europe. We have so many excellent opportunities to sample the wines. I was going to, we've got 10 minutes or so, so I just wanted to mention about mice. The mice market is an area that I suppose up until the last 10 years has totally been dominated by the Chinese, either internally within China or around Asia. And these are groups that would travel many hundred. In fact, I think there was a group recently went into France, which was 5,000 that went into France as a group. Now that is very unusual for us in Europe to have these type of numbers for a mice group. However, we are seeing that there are more inquiries. My company is having more inquiries now for mice groups from China, and they are, a small group is 300 or 400, and a large group is 3,000 or 4,000. This is going to give us huge problems across Europe because we just do not have, in many countries, certainly in many cities, the type of bed bank, the beds, hotel beds that can cope with that type of number, obviously in high season. If we can encourage them to come low season, then that would be magnificent, would help our hotels well, would help everybody, and would mean that we could extend our season. However, the Chinese tend to travel in their mice groups from May to September. So it is a matter of trying to encourage these inquiries to come. And one way of doing that, of course, is to encourage them to come on price. So if you can make it attractive for them to come in shoulder season, then I think you'll find that's a very, very good market, and one that will become very lucrative. I need a drink. That brings me now on to another question I've had from Ireland, actually. We were talking, they were asking about the direct flights and whether there is any hope, and I just mentioned, they mentioned obviously Ireland, because quite a lot of Chinese go to Ireland, but they come via Europe there are no direct flights into Dublin at the moment. In my research, there are many countries that are trying to attract direct flights in from China at the moment. Certainly Dublin, certainly Edinburgh, and I think there's a range of other countries. Now this is outside any of the influence that any of us doing this webinar today can possibly attract, but have any influence over. But it is something that if you can encourage your government and obviously the local airport to open communications with a Chinese airport, with a Chinese airline, then that will make a huge difference to your numbers. And we here in the UK have recently had an example. There's a direct flight that has come into Manchester for the last 12-18 months, and this has had a huge impact on the northwest of England as to the number of Chinese visitors coming in. Obviously it would do, but it is the key if you want to develop, if a country or a region wants to develop their inbound tourism from China, then a direct flight is really essential. However, of course, if you can work on as I said earlier, the students that are already here in Europe, then this will help and will give you sort of a way of learning about the Chinese culture and learning about how they like to be, how they like to travel. So gently, slowly into the market. Oh yes, the other thing that was talking about European, there are 2 or 3 good Chinese newspapers that are published in Europe. So these are Chinese papers that are published, obviously, in Chinese language and circulated on a controlled circulation basis within Europe. A lot of them through their Chinese cash and carry or the Chinese restaurants, but they do get out into the Chinese population. And it may well be a good way of, a low-cost way of advertising and promoting your area if you can maybe get a advertorial or even take an advert just to see whether or not you can attract some Chinese that are in Europe. That's an area. Somebody else was talking about Cantonese in their question. Be careful about that, because Cantonese, of course, is the Hong Kong language, and although Cantonese is spoken down the south, so that's in the Guangzhou area, Mandarin is the language that you need, and even if you're getting any audios translated or audios produced, then again, be careful of the dialect. Some Chinese can be quite difficult or a little bit not very pleasant if they hear a dialect which they find unacceptable. And by this, we may well mean a more country dialect rather than, say, a dialect which comes from a tier 1 or tier 2 city. So again, be aware of that, be aware of who is doing your audio for you. We've just got 3 more minutes or so, so just to wind up, there's again some questions here. There's a question here talking about the luxury market. Now, we in Europe use the term luxury quite glibly, but it is a term that is not particularly widely used in China. It's got connotations for the regime, the Chinese regime, which is not what they want to encourage. So be careful if you use the word luxury. High quality is acceptable, but luxury sometimes is badly translated and gives the impression of a very elite tour. And if you're trying to attract business travelers, then that may not be the message that they want to hear. So just luxury is a word that is be careful how you're using that. Business travelers, again, I come back to that, big way in a lot of countries, the newer countries that are new. Georgia, sorry, there's a lot of interest from Georgia. that I'm really convinced that the best way in for the newer countries that are looking to attract Chinese into Europe, try to attract the business traveller and the diplomats first, followed by the student, and then once you've got the direct routes coming in from China, then you can look at the wider tourism market. I'm thanking you all for your attention. I really hope that you found this interesting and informative.